She wasn't given a chance to defend herself. No last request. Virginia Tonelli's body was pushed into a crematory oven while she was still alive, and vanished in the stench of burning metal, military silence, and thick smoke. It wasn't just an execution. It was a ritual of erasure, the kind of punishment reserved for those who dare to think, organize, resist. Her body turned to ash, her story to political dust. Virginia didn't fall in battle. She was devoured by a system that saw every free-thinking woman as a threat. A nurse, a communist, the widow of a revolutionary, she embodied everything fascism feared most, burned without a trial, silenced without mourning, reduced to nothing. So no one else would dare follow her path. But there's one detail they didn't expect. Even without bones, she would keep speaking. And if you, like me, believe there are stories that weren't erased by accident, but by convenience, then you're in the right place. This channel exists to recover what they tried to bury, names like Virginia Tonelli's that should never have been forgotten. Make sure you're subscribed, and let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. I always read them. Before she became a symbol of resistance, Virginia Tonelli was just an ordinary girl in an Italy that was changing far too fast. She grew up near Castelnuovo del Friuli, in a modest home where scarcity was a part of daily life. Her father, a laborer with calloused hands and a strong voice, died when she was only 12, and with him, any trace of childhood vanished. From that point on, school became a luxury, and responsibility knocked hard, like an adult at the door. Still very young, she learned to sew. It was what was left for daughters of poor families: thread, needles, and silence. But even among fabric and stitching, there was something in Virginia that refused to be shaped. She watched. She listened to conversations at the market, read newspapers in secret, and understood, long before most adults, that there was something deeply wrong with the world around her. The problem wasn't just poverty, it was the structure that created it. In the years that followed, she became a nurse, not out of religious calling, but from a moral urgency. She wanted to care, but she also wanted to understand why so many bodies were arriving at the hospital mutilated by hunger and violence. In the damp halls of public hospitals, she saw more than illness. She saw abandonment, neglect, and a population treated like disposable waste. And it was there, among ether bottles and malnourished children, that the woman the regime would later try to erase began to form. She wasn't yet handing out pamphlets. She wasn't yet hiding weapons. But the idea that the world could and should be different was already growing inside her, and no one noticed. Because to the powerful, Virginia was just another invisible woman among many. Their mistake was believing invisibility meant powerlessness. To many, being a nurse was a quiet profession, caring for the sick, following orders, keeping composed. But for Virginia, it was exactly in those crowded hallways and forgotten wards that the real map of injustice revealed itself. She didn't just treat wounds, she listened. She heard desperate mothers who couldn't afford medicine, laborers with bones crushed by overwork, children wasting away before the state's indifference. Each case, an unfiled report. Each patient, a scream muffled by the normalization of suffering. While Mussolini's regime decorated Italy with parades and promises of national glory, Virginia saw what was left out of the speeches: hunger, fear, abandonment. It didn't take long for that awareness to move from internal rage to action. She began attending small underground meetings, reading leaflets denouncing fascism, realizing that in times of oppression, even compassion becomes a threat. Being a politically active woman was already suspicious. Being a nurse who sided with the poor, the workers, the widowed mothers, was an affront. But what truly put Virginia on the authorities' radar wasn't what she shouted, it was what she did, sheltering exiles, carrying coded messages, hiding papers in her apron. She wasn't waving a flag, she was resisting in daily acts, and that, to fascism, was even more dangerous. People who passed her thought they saw just a quiet professional, but in silence she was stitching a network of resistance with the same skill she used to suture wounds. The hospital was her observatory, the city her field of operations, and her body her only weapon. She knew the danger grew by the day, but she also knew that silence was a slow kind of death. The year was 1933. Europe was trembling. Dictators were rising, and once radical ideologies were becoming state policies. It was in this turbulent landscape that Virginia met Antonio, an anti-fascist activist with blazing ideas and a gaze that saw far. Their meeting wasn't by chance. It was inevitable. Two souls marked by the same unrest, two people who couldn't pretend neutrality in the face of injustice. They married that same year, in a time when loving someone political was already choosing a side in a war before the first shot was fired. Not long after, Antonio left to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He wasn't drafted, he volunteered. Fighting alongside the Republicans against the fascist advance in Spain was to him the natural continuation of what he already carried in his chest. And Virginia stayed, alone, but not inactive. If her husband fought with weapons, she fought with shelter. Their home, in French territory, became a haven for political exiles, deserters, persecuted communists, and even Jews seeking safe routes out of Nazi Germany. Each room, a hiding place, each visitor, a test of trust. The kitchen table became an improvised meeting room. The radio, once playing opera, now whispered encrypted news. While the neighbors looked away, Virginia became something far beyond a wife. She became a bridge between ideals and survival. But the cost soon came. Antonio was captured and deported back to Italy, where he would be imprisoned, and instead of retreating, Virginia deepened her involvement with the resistance. Her name began appearing in discreet reports. She was Luisa, the Red Nurse, the subversive's wife. To the regime, she was a shadow challenging the order. To those fighting for freedom, she was a beacon. The struggle, once theoretical, now burst into her personal life with full force. Her love for Antonio was no longer just a marital bond, it was a symbol. It stood for every couple torn apart by political violence, every embrace postponed by repression, every kiss replaced by secret letters. His absence hurt, but it didn't break her. On the contrary, it strengthened what was most dangerous about her to an oppressive regime: conviction. From that point on, her life no longer fit within the ordinary. Love became a cause, and the house a trench. Nothing would ever be the same. And she knew, when you love someone who's being persecuted, you're persecuted too. When Mussolini was overthrown in July 1943, many believed the terror had ended, but the fall of the dictator didn't bring freedom. Just a few months later, the Germans occupied northern Italy and created the so-called Italian Social Republic, a Nazi puppet regime upheld by weapons and fear. It was in this climate of false hope and renewed repression that Virginia Tonelli stopped being just a woman, a wife or a nurse. She became something else. She became Luisa. Luisa didn't sign papers, but she organized operations. She didn't speak loudly, but she coordinated routes. She carried messages in shopping bags, weapons hidden under hospital aprons, maps rolled inside diapers. Every street she knew became an alternate route. Every trusted friend, a link in the chain of resistance. The city where she once cared for children was now her zone of danger and influence. She knew she was marked. She knew that one mistake, one tip-off, one moment of distraction, and she'd be arrested, tortured, maybe killed. Still, she kept going. She handed out anti-fascist leaflets, attended secret meetings behind bakeries, collected food for fighters hiding in the mountains. She didn't carry machine guns, but she did something the regime considered even more dangerous. She connected people. Virginia didn't seek glory. She wanted justice, And to achieve it, she gave up her own identity. She lived under fake names, memorized numeric codes and impossible schedules. Each day brought a new mission. Each mission, the chance she wouldn't return. Being Louisa meant disappearing little by little each week, until no one could tell where the woman ended and the militant began. She knew time was running out. The repression was brutal, the Germans were growing impatient, and the Allies were advancing too slowly. Still, she didn't stop, because to Virginia the greatest danger wasn't dying, it was surviving knowing she hadn't done enough. She already knew the noose was tightening. The traces left by captured comrades, the increasing interrogations in nearby villages, the stares that lingered a second too long, all signs pointed to the fact that Louisa wouldn't go unnoticed for much longer. Even so, Virginia accepted one of the network's most delicate missions, to transport confidential documents to Trieste, a city that had become an extremely high-risk zone, directly controlled by German forces and fascist collaborators of the Republic of Salo. The plan seemed simple: a meeting point, a quick handoff, and an immediate return to Vicenza. She wouldn't be alone. A trusted colleague would go with her. But no mission is simple when the enemy already knows your name, even if it's hidden behind a code. On September 19th, 1944, the trap was sprung. Near the destination, Virginia was intercepted by fascist soldiers who already knew what to look for. There was no time to flee, no resistance. She was arrested on the spot, and the material she carried was seized. She wasn't taken to court. She had no lawyer. She was thrown into a dark cell in a building controlled by the fascist militia's secret service. For 10 days, she was brutally tortured. The goal was clear: to extract names, routes, meeting places, weapon caches, the structure of the resistance. But what they found wasn't weakness. It was silence. Virginia didn't betray anyone. Unofficial accounts from those who were in neighboring cells speak of muffled screams, deep wounds on her legs and back, bruises around her eyes, and a face so disfigured that few could recognize her afterward. She wasn't a soldier. She was a nurse. But at that moment, her body became a battlefield, a place where the goal wasn't justice but moral annihilation. Virginia's capture wasn't accidental. Experts now believe the mission to Trieste was sabotaged by informants embedded in the resistance network, traitors who, under threat or for reward, provided precise details of her movements that day. What seemed like a logistical misstep was, in reality, a carefully orchestrated ambush. She was in fascist custody, in Italian territory dominated by the Nazis, and for someone with her background, the only way out was death. But even that wouldn't come right away. Before the end, a crueler fate awaited her, one not limited to physical pain, but the systematic attempt to erase her existence entirely. She was no longer called Virginia, not even Louisa. Inside that cell, she became simply La Prigioniera, the prisoner. A woman with no name, no identity, no history. For 10 days, she was kept in complete isolation, subjected to physical and psychological torture sessions led by officers of the Italian Social Republic's political police, operating under direct authorization from the Nazi occupying forces. The order was clear: break her mind before her body. There were no formal interrogations, only violence, rhythmic punches, prolonged darkness, sleep deprivation, thermal shocks, deliberate cuts. Sometimes they left her lying on the cold floor just to let her hear the cries of other prisoners who couldn't endure. Screams were the ambient noise. The cell, a place where death came in installments. Unlike other political detainees, Virginia wasn't seen as just a militant. She was viewed as a coordinator. Her name had appeared in documents seized weeks earlier. She had housed resistance fighters, gathered weapons, distributed pamphlets with subversive content. She was a woman, yes, but not a typical victim of war. To them, she was a strategic enemy. That's why the pressure wasn't only to confess, it was to betray. During those 10 days, several prisoners later reported that the name Luisa was frequently mentioned by the soldiers. Some said it in anger, others with mockery, but none of them knew her real name. She had already been erased before she died. A woman turned into a code, then into a number. Food came cold when it came at all. The lights, on or off, followed no logic. Sometimes they opened the door just to let her overhear fake conversations, a manipulation tactic to force her into giving up information. But she didn't fall for it. She didn't name a single person. Her silence in that place spoke louder than any confession ever could. It's important to remember that at that time, the prison in Trieste was already being used as a sorting center for the Risiera di San Sabba concentration camp, the only Nazi camp with a crematory oven on Italian soil. That was where the no-return cases were sent. Virginia was marked as one of them. Once they realized nothing could be extracted from her, they decided she was no longer useful. All that remained was her example. And for the fascists, examples were always made through pain. When she was removed from the cell, no one said where she was being taken, but those who knew the system understood. She would not come out alive. After 10 days, Virginia was no longer just a woman in custody. She was a sentence waiting to be carried out. No formal charges, no signed documents, no evidence presented. After 10 days of torture, Virginia Tonelli was transferred, not by court order, but by direct decision of the fascist political police, who had already classified her as an unsubmissive and irredeemable element. Her destination? One of the most sinister places in World War II history, Risiera di San Sabba in Trieste. There were no trials there, no prosecutors, no promises of mercy. The facility, originally a rice factory, had been converted into a detention, torture, and extermination center by the Nazi army with logistical support from Italian fascists. It's estimated that around 5,000 people were killed there, most of them with no official record. It was a place designed so no one would leave, not alive, not remembered. Virginia wasn't transported like an ordinary prisoner. There was no formal escort, no entry log. She was taken as if she were cargo to be discarded. Witnesses reported that the vehicles used for such transfers were sealed, stifling, without ventilation. The journey lasted only a few hours, but the silence inside the trucks was already a prelude to execution. When she arrived at Risiera, no one called her by name. Her past as a nurse, as a wife, as a militant, none of that mattered anymore. All that remained was her body. A body that, to the system, needed to disappear. According to later records and investigations conducted decades afterward, Virginia was never even registered at the camp as a prisoner. She went directly to the extermination zone. There, the procedures were as cruel as they were efficient. The complex had a torture room, an isolation cell, and at its center a crematory oven, built specifically to dispose of bodies quickly and without trace. Unlike German camps, where some form of ritual was observed, Risiera's method was direct. Execution came before the record, death before the name. The reason for such haste? The Allied troops were approaching. The Germans knew they were losing the war, and the Italian fascists, desperate to cover up their collaboration, sped up executions and destroyed documents. Virginia entered that camp as an unregistered number. She would leave as smoke. She had no defense, no hearing, not even the right to know she was about to die. She was taken, transferred like a package, to disappear not only from life, but from history. But they failed. Risiera di San Sabba was not just a death camp. It was a machine of forgetting. There, they didn't just kill the bodies, they killed identity. Silence reigned completely, not out of respect, but by design. No prisoner screamed for help. They knew no one would come, and the executioners didn't speak. They simply carried out their orders. Unlike Auschwitz or Dachau, Riziera was built with a more immediate purpose: to eliminate quickly those deemed too dangerous to be interrogated. The process was cold, impersonal, industrial. Prisoners arrived, were visually assessed, and if considered useless or too influential, were sent straight to the execution chamber. Virginia Tonelli wasn't an armed fighter, but her influence, her network of contacts, and her persistence made her more dangerous than many soldiers. The camp had three main areas: overcrowded dormitories, isolation cells, and the yard where summary executions took place. At the center of it all, a structure straight from a nightmare: the crematory oven. It wasn't installed for sanitation, it was for political convenience. That's where the regime erased not only bodies, but any possibility of future investigation. At the end of each day, the ashes were swept and dumped into mass graves or nearby canals. No deaths were recorded. No executions were announced. Victims simply vanished. Some were shot before being burned. Others were thrown alive into the oven. A method reserved for those whose death was meant to inspire fear, even among the jailers. According to testimonies from soldiers and local residents, there were nights when the smell of burning flesh filled the air for miles. Virginia was taken directly to the extermination section. She had no contact with other prisoners. She was not given a uniform. She left no letters. Her death was treated as a priority, an immediate sentence carried out in haste, as if her very existence were an emergency to be corrected by fire. And so, in a place with no judges, no witnesses, no rites of passage, justice was murdered along with her. Because at Riziera, no one died just once. They died in the forgetting, in the absence of record, in the calculated attempt to erase memory with lime. But history, even when suffocated, fights to breathe. And what was burned that night wasn't enough to erase the name the fascists so desperately tried to silence. There were no final words, no priest, no farewell. When Virginia Tonelli was taken to the oven at Riziera di San Saba, not even the symbolic gesture of a formal execution was offered. She was pushed, alive, into the flames. Not by accident, not in haste, but by choice. A calculated, cold choice made to humiliate, to erase, and to turn her body into a silent warning. Later sources, including testimonies gathered during post-war trials of former fascists, confirmed, yes, some prisoners were thrown alive into the oven at Riziera. The method was not routine, it was reserved. Used in exemplary cases, such as influential members of the resistance whom the regime wanted not just to kill, but to erase from collective memory. To them, Virginia Tonelli was exactly that, a woman who had to be destroyed completely, without a trace of honor, without a body, without a grave. The ovens used crude fuel. The structure was rudimentary, but effective. The extreme heat made bodies disappear within hours, leaving only unrecognizable fragments. In Virginia's case, not even that remained. No teeth, no bones, no concrete evidence that could be exhumed later. Her disappearance was the final stage of her punishment. But there's one thing the machinery of terror never understood: ashes don't erase memory. On the contrary, sometimes they ignite it. And it was precisely the void left behind, the complete absence of remains, that made her death even more symbolic. The pain they caused was not forgotten. The silence they imposed one day began to speak. Virginia died as a symbol of what fascism hated most: a free, articulate, politically engaged woman, capable of influencing others. Throwing her alive into the fire was a form of ritual punishment, turning her into something monstrous in the eyes of her own executioners, as if her strength were an affront to their order. But ironically, what they achieved was the opposite. By leaving nothing behind, they left everything. The memory of the crime, the historical shame, the question without an answer. Why was a nurse treated like a military threat? Why did an unarmed woman have to be destroyed with such hatred? Why burn her if they could have killed her before? because she was dangerous, yes, but not by the strength of her fists. She was dangerous because of the strength of her ideas, and that not even fire could consume. When the war ended and the flames of Risiera went out, what remained was emptiness. A heavy silence hung over Trieste, as if the whole city knew what had happened there, but preferred not to speak it aloud. The name Virginia Tonelli wasn't immediately remembered. How could it be? There was no body, no gravestone, no death certificate, only absence. For years, her death was a buried wound. For those who knew her, the lack of answers was unbearable. For those who survived, silence was strategic. Speaking too much was still dangerous. The pain of her loss, for a time, became a matter of whispers. Her image wasn't celebrated. Her story wasn't told. It was as if the regime had won, as if forgetting were truly possible. But some details refused to vanish. A saved note, a vivid memory, a notebook filled with encrypted names, fragments of a life that little by little began to be pieced together. Over time, historians, activists, and survivors began stitching together what the fire couldn't erase. And then, what had been rumor became evidence. What was legend gained a date. What was silence gained a voice. In 1976, more than 3 decades after her death, Virginia Tonelli was officially recognized as a heroine of the Italian resistance. The same state that once allowed her execution now publicly declared her significance. Her name was inscribed among the martyrs of anti-fascism. In some northern Italian cities, streets and squares began to bear her name. But symbolic justice, though necessary, was never enough, because the pain wasn't just in her death. It was in how she was erased, in the fact that for so long her fight was treated as unwanted noise. She wasn't remembered in grand ceremonies. She wasn't featured in school books. Her final days weren't narrated on the radio. Perhaps the greatest pain was this, becoming ashes also in the memory of many. And still, she returned. Returned in restored documents, in stage plays, in modest monuments, and above all, returned in stories like this one, told by those who refuse to let forgetting win. Because there are pains that time doesn't erase, it only transforms. And when a woman like Virginia Tonelli is burned alive, what's lost isn't just a life, it's a mirror of everything a society allows when it chooses silence. Virginia Tonelli wasn't the only one, and maybe that makes her story even more urgent. During the years of war and occupation, thousands of Italian, French, Greek, Yugoslav and Polish women faced similar fates. Some disappeared in concentration camps, others were shot in remote villages, hanged in public squares, or burned alive like her. But all of them, without exception, were punished for daring to do something simple, to exist with their own voice. In Italy, a woman's role was strictly defined by fascism: wife, mother, servant of the homeland. The regime promoted submission as a civic virtue. Women who crossed that line were seen as aberrations, and those who joined the resistance, like Virginia, weren't just hunted, they were degraded, labeled witches, traitors, prostitutes. The attempt to erase their influence began with language and ended in fire. Records from the time revealed dozens of similar cases. Irma Bandiera, for example, was captured by fascists in Bologna, tortured for days and left dead with her eyes gouged out. Just like Virginia, she refused to give up any names. Ondina Petteani, deported to Auschwitz for being a resistance messenger, only survived because the war ended shortly before her scheduled execution. Others, like Giovanna Marturano and Lidia Beccaria Rolfi, managed to return, but carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Most of these women worked in so-called secondary roles, transporting weapons, communicating between cells, sheltering comrades. But without these roles, no military resistance operation could have survived. They were the seamstresses of revolution, the underground messengers, the invisible protectors who sabotaged terror with anonymous courage. Yet, in collective memory, Female heroism always arrived late. For decades, the official narrative centered on armed men, battalion commanders, martyrs with rifles. Meanwhile, the women who died without uniforms, without titles, without medals, were forgotten one by one. That's why telling the story of Virginia Tonelli matters, because when a woman is burned alive for refusing to bow her head, she doesn't die alone. She represents all the others who couldn't scream. She is a symbol of a gender that, for centuries, was excluded even from the history of resistance. She was a woman, she was a nurse, she was a revolutionary, but above all, she was living proof that courage also has a female face, and that the terror of authoritarian regimes was never just about weapons. It was also about the freedom they could never contain when it was born inside a woman. They threw her into the fire, believing they were extinguishing a threat. Burning the body, destroying the records, silencing the witnesses, everything was calculated to ensure that Virginia Tonelli would vanish without a trace. But they made a mistake. A mistake authoritarian regimes make time and again, confusing death with forgetting. Her body was destroyed, yes, but her name survived, and more than that, it multiplied. In the years following her execution, the world changed. Fascism fell, the war ended, and those once condemned as traitors were recognized as heroes. The struggle she waged, with pamphlets, with shelter, with silence in the face of torture, was finally called what it always was: legitimate resistance. In 1976, the Italian Republic declared Virginia Tonelli a national heroine of the resistance. It wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a reparation. Her name was inscribed among the martyrs of the anti-fascist movement. The woman they tried to erase became part of the foundation of the new Italy. From Verona to Vicenza, from Trieste to Rome, her name began appearing in schools, plazas, plaques, and books. The persecuted nurse became a street, became a statue, became a history lesson, but her true victory was something else. It was defeating the regime's greatest weapon, fear. Because her story began to be told by women and men who found in her a spark of courage. Each time someone speaks her name, the silence that once surrounded her breaks. Each time a young girl reads about her, the cycle of oppression weakens. Each time her photo appears on a school wall, the fire that consumed her loses its meaning. Virginia was not a saint, not an idealized martyr. She was human. She had doubts, fatigue, losses, but she kept going. And that's exactly why her victory is so powerful, because she didn't win with weapons or fiery speeches. She won with small, steady acts, with quiet determination, with love for what she believed in. And now, so many years later, the name the executioners tried to turn into smoke rises like a flag. Not of vengeance, but of memory. Because there is no justice without remembrance, and no free country can stand on buried skeletons. Virginia Tonelli won, not on the battlefield, but on the ground where the hardest war is fought, collective memory. And that no dictatorship has ever, or will ever, be able to dominate. If this story reached you today, it's because silence didn't win. May the name of Virginia Tonelli continue to echo the way it should have from the beginning, with honor, with pain, with truth. Because there are bodies that fire consumes, but there are memories that not even 1,000 ovens can erase. If you're not yet subscribed, now is the time. Here, each video is a rescue, each forgotten story, a form of reparation. And tell me in the comments, had you heard her name before? In the next video, you'll hear another true story, another life marked by death, and one that still carries questions no one has dared to answer. See you there.